One person who could benefit from the Iran war, at least over the short term, is Russian President Vladimir Putin. High energy prices are good news for Russia's economy. It stands to profit from oil sales, especially since the U.S. has relaxed sanctions on its oil exports. But Russia is also one of the few countries that have maintained close ties with Iran, receiving military support for its war in Ukraine. Depending on the outcome of the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, Moscow could end up losing another key ally in the Middle East. Well, for more on this, we can speak now with Ivana Stradner. She's a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Russia program and joins us from Washington. Ivana, what can you tell us about how Russia views the latest developments in the Gulf? How is it trying to position itself in this situation?
So I have to admit that Putin is absolutely not surprised by what's happening right now in Iran, as the Russian media has been warning about a potential conflict there over the past few months. But what Putin is trying to do, every crisis he's trying to use for his own benefit. So he is more than happy what's happening on one side in Iran, but also he's also worried about what's happening in Iran. He's happy because prices of energy is rising. He's also happy because the West is focusing all attention right now on the Middle East, but also in practical views, he's offering to mediate this conflict. But I also have to provide another side of the story that Putin is also not happy with what's happening in Iran because Russia and Iran are strategic partners.
Indeed, they have this strategic partnership, but there were reports that Tehran was disappointed by Moscow's apparent lack of support during the 12-day war with the U.S. and Israel last year. Is there any indication that Russia is giving Iran more assistance this time around?
So with friends like Putin, Russia's allies do not need enemies. They're all walking on thin ice because this is not only about Iran that you mentioned in 2025. Russia also threw Armenia under the bus with its war against Azerbaijan. Putin also was very silent on Syria and indeed very much silent on Venezuela. So whoever believes that Russia is going to send tanks and jets to Iran is sorely mistaken. But here is a catch. Russia is still able to provide Iran with intelligence and other support. So that's also something that we should not exclude in terms of relations. Of course, Russia is justifying this, claiming that they do not have any obligation to help Iran. But that tells you really all you need to know that Putin is not in good stance.
The U.S. says it's been assured by Russia that Moscow is not sharing intelligence with Iran regarding American military assets in the Gulf region, for example. Should Washington accept those assurances at face value?
I have to admit, that words are cheap oftentimes for policymakers in Washington. So they think, let's tell Putin whatever he wants to hear. That will, melt his heart, and he is going to continue with negotiations. Here's the thing. If you know a little bit about Russia, you do not need to be an expert on it. You have to understand that Russia's greatest asset is indeed intelligence support for their allies. So I would actually personally believe that, based on reports that I saw over the past few days, that Russia is indeed providing Iran with intelligence. But here is a good thing. Look, the United States has also an outstanding intelligence. So the very first fact that we were able to report on this and to disclose, it tells us also that Russia and that Putin is, we should not put him on a pedestal, that he's a master intelligence strategist.
What do you make of the cordial, mutually reassuring tone of communications that we're seeing between the White House and the Kremlin regarding Iran? It sounds like they're talking as if they're on the same page somehow.
studying, for example, negotiations and reading any negotiations book, in the Western culture, you have to think about win-win strategy. Russia doesn't think like that. For Putin, it's okay if both sides lose. And if he has to lose, his opponent has to lose more. Why am I emphasizing this? President Trump is a real estate expert, and he thinks about negotiations through trade. And that words in negotiations can be also used, as a leverage. But here is the thing. Putin is not absolutely willing to negotiate in good faith. He's using Iran to posture himself as a mediator. And then to extract, his gains in Ukraine and use that as a bargaining chip. So, any words when it comes to Putin, honestly, are meaningless because you just really have to go and look at agreements that the United States signed in the past with Russia and how many of them were violated so far. So whoever believes, that Putin is willing to negotiate in good faith lives in a parallel universe.
Talk to us about oil prices here, because the Russian economy runs on oil. The war in Iran is likely to have knock-on effects. For the war in Ukraine, are soaring energy prices really going to provide the cash injection that Russia's war economy so desperately needs to continue its invasion of Ukraine?
Russia's center of gravity is indeed energy. And President Trump did an outstanding thing while imposing secondary sanctions on Russia, with the hope that that is going to push Putin to negotiate in good faith. And here is the thing. A lot of experts have been hoping that Russian economy is going to collapse because of the energy and because of sanctions, and that part of revenue is actually fueling Russian war machine. Here is the thing. You're right that the energy prices and oil prices are going up, and there are a lot of reports how Russia is going to benefit from this. I want to make a little bit cautionary statement about this because I think it's too early to have a gloom and doom scenario that Russia is going to benefit from current prices within the next 30 days. Yes, it can, they can benefit from it in the short run, but let's see how this is going to go in the long run. And also Putin, make no mistake, he's going to also use that as a bargaining chip with Europe to threaten, things related to energy. But to conclude, I think it's too early to make doom and gloom scenario on this, but it still warrants a lot of caution how Russia might use that in the long run.
For Russia, this war could bring short-term benefits, as we've just discussed, with rising oil prices. But if the regime in Iran is overthrown or significantly weakened, what would that mean for Vladimir Putin over the long term? So you're absolutely right to know that Putin is watching, and he already saw what happened in Venezuela. He's now observing what's happening in Iran. There are two sides of the story. Russia is not anymore truly dependent on Iran when it comes to drones and weapons. So they do not need instrumental support from Russia. This is now more as a strategic partnership, which brings me to the next point, which is if the regime collapses in Iran and it brings someone who is more pro-Western, for example, and not so keen to cooperate with Putin, that is going to be another humiliation for Russia and for Putin in particular. But here is the third point, which is whether Putin believes that inside Russia, the regime change is possible. And I want to emphasize that as soon as Putin came to power, and especially after massive protests in Russia more than a decade ago, he completely strengthened, domestic repression and closed down the information space to make sure that something like that
does not happen. So that's his biggest fear. But also, I doubt that people sitting in Brussels or London or Washington are willing to do and to challenge Putin in the way that the regimes in Venezuela or Iran have been challenged so far.
Ivana, thank you very much for your insights. That was Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Thank you very much.